East Berlin, November 1987. A physicist disappears from a secure Soviet research facility. Within 72 hours, Israeli intelligence will attempt the most audacious extraction in Cold War history. But the man they're risking everything to save isn't who he claims to be. And by the time Mossad realizes the truth, 3 of their best operatives will be walking into a trap designed by the KGB's most brilliant counterintelligence officer. What happens next will rewrite the rules of espionage forever. This is the story of Operation Wintergarten, the mission that almost destroyed Mossad's European network and the impossible gamble that saved it. The file arrived at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv on a Tuesday morning in September 1987. It came through the Vienna station, passed hand to hand through a network of couriers that stretched from Moscow to the Austrian capital. The contents were extraordinary. A Soviet nuclear physicist named Viktor Rabinovich was offering to defect. He claimed to possess detailed knowledge of the Soviet Union's tactical nuclear weapons program, specifically the miniaturized warheads being developed for battlefield use in Europe. He wanted safe passage to Israel, he wanted asylum, and he wanted to bring his family. The timing could not have been more significant. Israeli intelligence had spent years trying to penetrate the Soviet nuclear establishment. The Cold War was entering what many believed would be its final phase. Gorbachev's reforms were creating uncertainty throughout the Eastern Bloc. And the prospect of a Jewish scientist with access to Moscow's most sensitive weapons research offering to defect was precisely the kind of opportunity that careers were built upon, or destroyed by. Yitzhak Hofi, the Mossad director, assembled a small team to evaluate the approach. The assessment took 3 weeks. Background checks through available channels confirmed that Viktor Rabinovich existed. He was 54 years old, born in Leningrad to a Jewish family that had survived the siege. He had studied physics at Moscow State University, earned his doctorate in nuclear engineering, and spent the past 2 decades working at Artemis 16, the closed city where Soviet weapons research was conducted behind layers of security that made the facility invisible to Western intelligence. But the evaluation also raised concerns that would prove prophetic. Rabinovich's approach was too clean. Defectors rarely presented themselves with such clarity of purpose. Usually they were desperate, conflicted, motivated by complex mixtures of ideology, resentment, and fear. Rabinovich's communication suggested a man who had carefully planned every detail, who understood exactly what he was offering and what he expected in return. The professional calm troubled several analysts who noted that genuine defectors usually exhibited more psychological turbulence. There was also the question of access. How could a physicist working in a closed city establish contact with Israeli intelligence? The communication chain he had used required resources and tradecraft that seemed beyond what a scientist would possess. Someone had helped him. The question was whether that someone was a friend or an enemy. The debate within Mossad lasted through October. One faction argued that the opportunity was too valuable to ignore. Soviet nuclear secrets could provide Israel with crucial intelligence about weapons that might one day be transferred to hostile Arab states. The knowledge Rabinovich claimed to possess would take years to acquire through conventional intelligence gathering. The risk was worth the reward. The opposing faction urged caution. Everything about the approach suggested a provocation. The KGB had grown increasingly sophisticated in its counterintelligence operations. They had learned from past defections, studying how Western intelligence services evaluated and extracted assets. A physicist offering nuclear secrets was precisely the bait they would use to draw Mossad into a trap that could expose networks built over decades. In the end, the decision fell to Hofi himself. He authorized a limited operation to make contact with Rabinovich and assess his legitimacy. If the initial meeting suggested authenticity, a full extraction would be planned. If not, the approach would be terminated and the source abandoned. The directive was clear. Proceed with extreme caution. Trust nothing. Verify everything. The man chosen to lead the assessment was David Levi, a veteran case officer who had spent 15 years running agents in Eastern Europe. Levi understood the Soviet system better than almost anyone in Israeli intelligence. He had recruited sources inside the Polish security services, turned a Czech diplomat, and once extracted an asset from behind the Iron Curtain, using a method so audacious that it remained classified decades later. If anyone could determine whether Viktor Rabinovich was genuine, it was Levi. He arrived in Vienna in early November, operating under diplomatic cover as a cultural attaché at the Israeli embassy. His instructions were to establish contact with Rabinovich's intermediary, a Hungarian businessman named Laszlo Kovács, who traveled regularly between Budapest and Vienna for reasons that had nothing to do with commerce. Kovács was the courier who had delivered Rabinovich's initial communication. He would arrange the first meeting. The rendezvous took place in a coffee house near the Stephansdom, Vienna's famous cathedral. Levi arrived early, taking a corner table that offered a view of both entrances. He ordered coffee and waited. At precisely 3 p.m., Kovács entered. The Hungarian was younger than Levi had expected, perhaps 40, well-dressed in a Western suit that suggested success in his purported business ventures. He carried a newspaper folded in a specific way that served as recognition signal. They spoke in German, the common language of Central European intelligence work. Kovács explained the situation. Rabinovich had been planning his defection for 2 years. He had carefully copied documents, memorized technical specifications, and cultivated the contacts necessary to establish communication with the West. His motivation was partly ideological. He had grown disillusioned with the Soviet system, particularly after learning that his daughter had been denied university admission because of the family's Jewish background. But there was also fear. The physicist believed he was under surveillance, that security services had begun to suspect him. If he did not leave soon, he would be arrested. Levi listened without revealing his thoughts. The story was compelling, but also convenient. Every element seemed designed to appeal to Israeli sympathies. The Jewish persecution angle, the ideological disillusionment, the urgency created by supposed surveillance. It was either genuine or expertly constructed deception. The problem was distinguishing between the two. He asked questions about Rabinovich's work, technical details that only someone with genuine nuclear expertise could answer. Kovács provided responses that were detailed enough to suggest authenticity, but vague enough to indicate he was merely transmitting information he did not fully understand. This was consistent with being an intermediary rather than a fabricator. A deceiver would have prepared more precisely scripted answers. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Levi had not reached a conclusion, but he had identified the next step. He needed to meet Rabinovich directly. Only face-to-face evaluation could determine whether the physicist was genuine. Kovács agreed to arrange the encounter. It would take place in East Berlin, where Rabinovich could travel under the pretext of attending a scientific conference. The risk was significant. East Berlin was KGB territory, but it was also the only location where such a meeting was feasible. Levi returned to Tel Aviv to brief Hofi on his assessment. The director listened without interruption, then asked a single question. "What does your instinct tell you?" Levi hesitated. The professional in him recognized the warning signs. The approach was too smooth, the asset too perfect. But there was something else, something in Kovács's manner that suggested genuine fear rather than performance. He had seen deception before. This felt different. "My instinct says proceed, but prepare for betrayal." Hofi nodded. He authorized the next phase. Levi would travel to East Berlin with a small team. They would meet Rabinovich, evaluate him, and if satisfied, begin planning extraction. But they would also prepare contingencies for the possibility that everything was a trap. Nothing would be left to chance. The team assembled in Vienna on November 15th. Besides Levi, there were 3 operatives. Sarah Mizrahi, a 32-year-old field officer who spoke fluent Russian and German, would serve as translator and secondary evaluator. Yosef Klein, AI communications specialist, would maintain contact with Tel Aviv and coordinate any emergency extraction. And Michael Stern, a former paratrooper now working for Mossad's operational division, would provide security. Each carried documents identifying them as Austrian business people traveling to East Berlin for a trade exhibition. They crossed through Checkpoint Charlie on November 17th, their cover stories holding under the bored scrutiny of East German border guards. The city beyond the wall felt different from their previous experiences. Something was changing in the Eastern Bloc. The rigidity that had characterized these societies for decades seemed to be softening. People spoke more freely. The fear was still present, but no longer absolute. The meeting with Rabinovich was scheduled for November 19th in a small cafe near Alexanderplatz. The location was chosen because it offered multiple exit routes and relatively sparse surveillance compared to other areas of the city. But Levi knew that no location in East Berlin was truly safe. Every cafe had informants, every street corner had watchers. Operating here meant accepting that you were observed and hoping that your cover held long enough to accomplish your mission. Rabinovich arrived exactly on time. He was smaller than Levi had imagined, a compact man with thick glasses and the pallid complexion of someone who spent too many hours in windowless laboratories. He moved nervously, glancing around the cafe in a manner that suggested either genuine fear or expert simulation of it. Sarah approached first, ordering coffee and striking up conversation in Russian. Levi watched from an adjacent table, evaluating the physicist's responses. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. Rabinovich spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as if he feared being interrupted before he could say everything. He described his work in detail, technical specifications about warhead design, miniaturization challenges, deployment strategies. He named colleagues, described facilities, outlined security protocols. The information was either extraordinarily valuable or extraordinarily sophisticated fabrication. But something troubled Levi. The physicist's fear seemed genuine, yet his manner of expressing it was somehow off. He spoke about surveillance as if describing a problem rather than experiencing terror. He mentioned his family's situation with concern, but not the desperate urgency that characterized genuine defectors. It was as if he had rehearsed the emotional content along with the technical information. After the meeting, the team reconvened at their hotel to assess what they had learned. Sarah was cautiously optimistic. The technical details Rabinovich had provided were beyond what could be easily fabricated. If he was a plant, the KGB had invested extraordinary resources in preparing him. Michael, the security officer, was more skeptical. He had noticed surveillance during the meeting, professionals, who seemed more interested in watching the Israelis than the physicist. Yosef reported that communications traffic from their location had increased noticeably after the cafe rendezvous. Levi weighed all of this. The evidence pointed in conflicting directions. The technical information suggested authenticity. The operational environment suggested a trap. He made a decision that would prove fateful. He sent a message to Tel Aviv requesting authorization for a second meeting. But he also requested something else. He wanted the station to activate a dormant asset in East German intelligence. Someone who might be able to determine whether the KGB had orchestrated Rabinovich's approach. The response came within hours. Both requests were approved. The second meeting would take place on November 22nd. And by that time, Mossad would know whether Viktor Rabinovich was a gift or a trap. What Levi did not know was that the answer to that question was far more complex than either possibility suggested. The asset's name was Klaus Brenner. He had worked for the Stasi, East Germany's notorious security service, for 18 years. For the last 7 of those years, he had also worked for Mossad. His recruitment had been patient and methodical, exploiting a combination of financial pressure and ideological disillusionment that made him willing to betray the system he served. He had provided valuable intelligence about East German surveillance methods, Soviet military movements, and the internal politics of the Eastern Bloc's security services. Activating Brenner carried significant risk. If his treachery was discovered, he would be executed. The information he could provide had to be worth that danger. In this case, Levi believed it was. The contact protocol required 3 days to execute. Dead drops, brush passes, signals embedded in the behavior of ordinary life. By November 21st, Brenner's report was in Levi's hands. Its contents changed everything. Viktor Rabinovich was not a simple plant. He was something far more dangerous. According to Brenner's sources within the Stasi, Rabinovich was the centerpiece of an operation code-named Wintergarten, designed by Colonel Alexei Volkov, the KGB's chief of counterintelligence for Western operations. The physicist was genuine in the sense that he actually possessed the technical knowledge he claimed. But his defection was controlled. Every step had been orchestrated to draw Israeli intelligence into a trap that would allow the KGB to identify and neutralize Mossad networks throughout Eastern Europe. But there was more. Brenner's report included a detail that transformed the situation from dangerous to impossible. Rabinovich himself did not know he was being used. He believed his defection was genuine. He believed he was risking everything to escape the Soviet system and bring his family to freedom. The KGB had manipulated him into making contact with the West, using intermediaries he trusted, never revealing that his handlers served Moscow rather than Jerusalem. Levi stared at the report for a long time. The implications were profound. The KGB had created a perfect trap using an unwitting asset. Rabinovich's authenticity was genuine because he believed in it. His fear was real because he thought he was actually defecting. And the technical information he offered was accurate because he had no reason to provide fabrications. The only falsehood was the broader context, the invisible architecture of deception surrounding him. But this knowledge also created an opportunity. If Rabinovich did not know he was being used, then he could be turned, not against the Soviets, but against the operation controlling him. If Mossad could extract him despite the trap, they would accomplish three things. They would acquire a genuine nuclear expert with valuable information. They would humiliate Volkov by defeating his carefully constructed operation. And they would demonstrate that Israeli intelligence could not be manipulated even by the KGB's best efforts. The question was how to accomplish this without sacrificing the team. Levi spent the night before the second meeting planning. He outlined scenarios, calculated risks, and developed contingencies for possibilities ranging from success to catastrophe. By morning, he had a strategy. It was audacious to the point of recklessness. It relied on timing so precise that any deviation would prove fatal. And it required trusting Rabinovich with the truth about his own situation. The second meeting took place as scheduled, in a different location selected specifically for its characteristics. The Prenzlauer Berg district offered narrow streets, dense residential buildings, and multiple escape routes through courtyards that connected to parallel streets. If surveillance attempted to close in, there were options for evasion that did not exist in more exposed locations. Rabinovich arrived looking even more nervous than before. Something had changed. He spoke quickly about increased surveillance at his hotel, about a colleague who had asked strange questions, about a sense that time was running out. Levi listened, evaluating whether this fear was genuine or whether Volkov was increasing pressure to accelerate the operation. When Rabinovich finished speaking, Levi did something that violated every principle of intelligence tradecraft. He told the physicist the truth. He explained what Brenner had discovered. He described Wintergarten, Volkov's role, the controlled nature of what Rabinovich believed was genuine defection. He watched as the physicist's face cycled through disbelief, denial, and finally a terrible recognition that transformed his features. Everything, Rabinovich whispered. Everything was manipulated. Not everything, Levi replied. Your knowledge is real. Your desire to leave is real. Your family's situation is real. But the people who helped you make contact with us serve the people you're trying to escape. They've been using you to get to us. The physicist was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by something harder. What do you want me to do? Levi outlined the plan. Rabinovich would continue as if nothing had changed. He would meet with his handlers, provide the reports they expected, maintain the fiction that the trap was proceeding as designed. But he would also provide Mossad with information about KGB surveillance patterns, communication schedules, and extraction protocols. When the moment came for the final phase of Wintergarten, when Volkov expected to spring his trap, the Israelis would already be gone. And they would take Rabinovich with them. The physicist agreed without hesitation. Whatever doubts he might have harbored about Israeli intentions had been dissolved by Levi's honesty. A handler who lied might be manipulating him for different purposes. A handler who told him the truth, even when that truth was painful, was someone he could trust. Over the following 3 days, Rabinovich provided intelligence that allowed Mossad to map Wintergarten with precision. There were 12 KGB officers assigned to the operation, supported by Stasi personnel who believed they were participating in a standard surveillance exercise. The trap would be sprung on November 25th, when Rabinovich was scheduled to be extracted through a route that would funnel the Israeli team into a kill zone near the border. Once there, they would be arrested, photographed, and used as evidence of Israeli espionage operations in East Germany. The resulting diplomatic crisis would allow Moscow to pressure Bonn into expelling Israeli intelligence personnel throughout West Germany. But now Mossad knew everything, and knowledge was power. The extraction took place on November 24th, 24 hours before Volkov expected. Levi had arranged for a distraction, an unrelated incident at Checkpoint Charlie that would draw Stasi attention away from Prenzlauer Berg at the critical moment. The team moved through the streets in the early hours of morning, when surveillance was thinnest and the city slept under gray winter clouds. Rabinovich joined them at a prearranged location, bringing nothing but the clothes on his back and a small notebook containing specifications he had memorized over decades of work. His family would have to wait. Extracting them was impossible under current conditions. But Levi promised that they would not be abandoned. Once the immediate danger passed, resources would be committed to bringing them out. The route led not toward the border crossings, where KGB anticipated the Israelis would attempt to pass, but towards something far more unconventional. A tunnel. It had been constructed years earlier by West German intelligence for entirely different purposes. Mossad had obtained knowledge of its existence through sources that remained classified. The tunnel entrance was located in the basement of a building ostensibly used for commercial storage. It ran for nearly 300 meters beneath the wall, emerging in a warehouse in West Berlin. The team entered the tunnel at 4:47 a.m. The passage was narrow, poorly lit, and smelled of earth and decay. Rabinovich struggled with claustrophobia, his breath coming in short gasps as the walls seemed to close around him. Sarah stayed close, speaking quietly in Russian, calming him with words that blended reassurance with distraction. Behind them, Michael watched for pursuit. There was none. The distraction at Checkpoint, Charlie had succeeded beyond expectations, drawing most available Stasi personnel toward the border crossing. Volkov's people remained focused on the false extraction route, waiting for prey that would never arrive. They emerged in West Berlin at 5:23 a.m. The warehouse was empty, prepared by assets who had been activated specifically for this purpose. A vehicle waited in the loading bay. Within minutes, they were moving through streets that belonged to a different world, a world where the wall was behind them and the nightmare of Wintergarten had been defeated. Rabinovich sat in the back seat, staring at the city passing outside the windows. He had never seen West Berlin. The lights, the advertisements, the evidence of prosperity that the Soviet system could never match. He wept quietly, not from joy, but from the accumulated stress of weeks spent living a deception within a deception. The debriefing took place in a safe house in Munich over the following 2 weeks. Rabinovich provided everything he knew about Soviet nuclear weapons development, information that would take years to fully analyze and exploit. He also provided details about Wintergarten that allowed Mossad to understand how close they had come to catastrophe. Volkov's operation had been brilliant. Without Brenner's warning, the entire team would have been captured, and the damage to Israeli intelligence would have been severe. But there was an epilogue that transformed the story from victory into something more complex. 3 months after the extraction, Klaus Brenner disappeared. His body was found in a forest outside East Berlin, executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. The Stasi had discovered his treachery, though how remained unclear. Perhaps there was a leak in Vienna. Perhaps Brenner's activation for Wintergarten had triggered suspicion that he had managed to avoid for years. Perhaps the KGB had always known and simply waited for the right moment to act. His death weighed heavily on Levi. An asset lost was a betrayal of the implicit promise that handlers made to their sources. You trust us with your life, and we will protect you. Brenner had trusted, and he had died. The intelligence he provided had saved the team and secured Rabinovich's extraction. But that success was forever shadowed by the cost. Rabinovich eventually settled in Israel, taking a position at the Weizmann Institute where he continued research unrelated to weapons development. His family was extracted 18 months later through an operation that remains classified. He lived quietly, gave occasional interviews to historians, and died in 2019 without ever fully reconciling the contradictions of his experience. He had been simultaneously genuine and manipulated, a defector and an unwitting agent, a man who escaped the Soviet system by being used as its instrument against the West. Colonel Alexei Volkov remained in the KGB until the Soviet collapse. His career never recovered from the Wintergarten failure. He had designed the perfect trap and watched it spring on empty air. The humiliation followed him through the declining years of Soviet power and into the chaos that followed. He died in Moscow in 1998, reportedly still bitter about the operation that had defined his professional life. And David Levy? He continued serving Mossad for another decade, running operations that remained classified and training a new generation of officers in the tradecraft he had mastered. He retired in 1998, wrote no memoirs, gave no interviews, and disappeared into the anonymity that intelligence professionals cultivate as carefully as their covers. Those who knew him remembered one lesson he taught above all others. In this work, the greatest skill is not deception. It is the ability to recognize when you are being deceived and the courage to act on that recognition before the trap closes. Wintergarten proved that lesson in ways that textbooks could never capture. It demonstrated that the boundary between hunter and hunted was always thinner than it appeared. That confidence could become the instrument of defeat. That victory was not a destination but a momentary advantage in struggles that never truly ended. The Cold War would end within 2 years of Rabinovich's extraction. The wall would fall. The Soviet Union would collapse. The certainties that had shaped espionage for 4 decades would dissolve into new uncertainties, new conflicts, new deceptions. But the principles remained constant. Trust nothing. Verify everything. And when you recognize the trap closing around you, have the courage to break the pattern before it's too late. This is the story of Operation Wintergarten, a defection that was never what it seemed, a trap that became its own undoing, and a reminder that in the shadow wars between nations, the greatest victories are often invisible, known only to those who fought them, and the historians who piece together fragments decades after the participants have gone silent.